Right, next up is Lotta Berg, and I'm very proud to know Lotta. Lotta has an extensive record of research in animal welfare, lots of farm animals, but she's also got a voice that's heard and listened to and acted upon by policy makers throughout the world. So I'm very proud that she's come and agreed to talk to us. Lotta.
Thank you very much. Right, so my name is Lotta Berg. I'm working at the Department of Animal Environment and Health at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, but I'm also associated to the Swedish Centre for Animal Welfare. And one of the issues that I've been working with is welfare aspects of captive breeding and reintroduction programs. So I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to these topics, maybe not delivering all the answers, but rather raising a number of questions. If we talk about conservation biology and animal welfare, there are two main aspects involved. One is the survival of species, that's in focus of conservation biology, and the welfare of individual animals, which is in focus of animal welfare management aspects of things. However, and sometimes it's said that there are a lot of contradictions between those two, and I don't agree. I think that in many cases they are very much compatible, that whatever is good for the individual animal is usually in the benefit of the survival of the species. But of course there are exceptions, that sometimes there is a trade-off where some harm has to be done to individual animals to conserve a species, and that's what I'm going to discuss in this presentation. We know, in theory, a lot of people out there will argue that, well, we shouldn't interfere with wildlife, we should leave them alone, they're not our responsibility, and we shouldn't make their life difficult. The problem is that we already are quite apart from any kind of conservation effort, especially without conservation efforts, where there is all sorts of loss of biodiversity or human-induced habitat loss. It may be non-intentional, but it's still a problem to wildlife. We can have overgrazing by livestock. We can have various invasive species that have been introduced by humans to the wrong spots of the world. All sorts of infrastructure development projects, ruining forests, beaches, steppes, anything. Hunting, of course, in some regions can be a huge problem. And just general competition for space. Spread of pathogens when we bring ourselves and our livestock into areas where it comes into contact with wildlife, etc. So like it or not, even without any deliberate intervention, we are interfering with wild animal welfare. And influence the quality of life and survival when they can no longer choose the environment they'd like to, when they can't find the food they need, when they end up in pain, suffering, and death because of things that humans do without actually intending to harm wildlife. It's just a side effect. So the goal of wildlife conservation programs in general is to create a viable or sustain viable population that can persist without continuous human intervention. If we talk wildlife conservation, that's actually what we're looking for. Indirectly then saving species before they go extinct, being locally or globally. Okay, so then, how can we do this? What type of wildlife conservation programs are there, and how do they relate to animal welfare? Well, and now what happened? Nope. Okay, let's look at the terminology for a while. The simplest form of species conservation would be the in situ conservation, where we actually do whatever we do out there in the wild. That would be preserving valuable habitats, or managing them, or even recreating or improving valuable habitats with a certain species in mind. It could be creating nature reserves, national parks, bans or restrictions on hunting, but also imposing predator control. If there's a predator that is really threatening, with the help of humans usually, a local species. There could be additional feeding, etc., in harsh times, and that all this would qualify as in situ conservation. So that's about giving existing populations a better chance, improving the conditions. But that is not always enough to save threatened species. So then there are more active ways of intervention. The simpler one is still using animals that are caught in the wild, brought in, given some extra help, and then released again. That would be called a head starting program. That would be like bringing tadpoles in, rearing them from the wild and letting the frogs out. You have the example there of the spoon-billed sandpiper, a rare wader bird, where eggs are brought in, hatched under controlled circumstances. The chicks are reared over the first few weeks, when usually a lot of them die in nature, and especially if the conditions in nature are poor. And then you release them when they're a bit bigger, a bit older, and a bit more likely to survive. So that's a head starting program. And then there's, of course, translocation programs with or without temporary captivity, where birds or mammals or whatever animals we're talking about are caught somewhere, can actually be insects as well, and translocated to another spot geographically where they are less threatened. It could be that there is, in their original habitat, is being threatened by urban development, and they are moved to another forest, let's say this little beetle, where it's more likely to survive. They can also, in this translocation process, be kept temporarily in captivity, or just actually taken from one spot to the other one. We have had the example in Sweden of the German program where they've been catching capercailles and bringing them to Germany. And this is, of course, for not creating completely new populations, but reinforcing or supplementing existing populations that are weak. And then we go to the more sort of further, more deep interventions, where we have captive breeding programs, where animals are wild caught at some point, brought into some kind of breeding area. Could be a zoo, could be a private place just aimed for this purpose, where you're proliferating the species and then reintroducing them to areas where there either already are conspecifics, where there's a small population that has to be supplemented with these recently bred animals that have been bred in captivity, or so that would be back in the original geographic area where you took the parents from, or the grandparents, or the great-great-great-grandparents, whatever. But there could also be transfer to completely new areas, which is sometimes referred to as conservation introduction or assisted colonization, where the old area for the species is for some reason no longer good for them. So this has been done to a wide range of species. There's also the issue of rewilding. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but that's related to, usually the term rewilding is used for the megafauna, like large herbivores, possibly also large carnivores, and aiming at restoring entire ecosystem functions, not necessarily species, but a function. Like in the Dutch example here, we could have some kind of large predator could have been introduced, theoretically, to add that ecosystem function, and now humans is doing it instead by hunting. So that's another option. So what are then the animal welfare risks related to these interventions? Well, there are a number of risks when animals are being captured. We heard Åsa talk about that earlier, and I'm not going to repeat all of it, but just of course, if you want to use wild caught animals, the catching of them in itself is poses a risk. Then, of course, if they're being held in captivity, short-term or long-term, that may involve risks. And also, there are a number of animal welfare-related risks after release. And one could argue that, well, that's not a problem. They're out in the wild, and they're wildlife, let them do whatever they can. But you can also argue that because we bred them in captivity, we have a responsibility. People will have different opinions on this, mind you. So looking a little bit more at the details, risks at capture. Of course, animals come into harm by traps or arrows, all sorts of injuries by being chastened. That is a risk. Being severely stressed by the process itself, and dying in transport. I mean, transport is a stressful event. So yes, that is something to bear in mind, those risks. Both when, of course, at capture, but then sometimes they're being transported again before release, most likely, and that's another risk. When held in captivity, we have all the problems related to bad management. And it doesn't have to be intentional again, it could be just lack of knowledge or lack of resources in some cases. So anything related to poor quality housing, poor management, poor feeding, so nutritional problems because people either don't know how to feed a certain species or don't have the resources for it. Animals developing health or behavioral problems, animals becoming used to life in captivity, animals not becoming properly prepared for a life in the wild, and I come back to that. So there's also the issue of future risk related to the choice of breeding animals, and we have been touching on that earlier today. The involuntary selection that you get when keeping animals in captivity. You breed the animals that actually thrive in captivity, the ones that will be doing okay, the ones that will not try to kill their managers, and yeah. And there's also the risk of domestication. That's what we're talking about here, indirect domestication, when kept in captivity for generations and generations and generations. And then, of course, once they are released, we're talking captive breeding programs, but also translocation, relocation programs, is the fact that you may actually end up releasing them in a habitat that is not as suitable as it looks to us, because we see it with different eyes compared to what the animal does. It's also a matter of it's really, really difficult to train or prepare animals in captivity for finding shelter, finding feed. I mean, you can try, but it's not simple. Training them to build nests, having the right material there, if it's a nest-building species, being able to defend territory against conspecifics, and not being trained to how to avoid predators, which is really tough in a captive situation. Being released in a group of conspecifics, which is not the ideal one, can be a true problem. And then, of course, all the normal dangers out there, traffic, very important, hunting, poaching. So then, of course, we need to think about how to mitigate these welfare risks, and that's a full day lecture in itself, but I'll give you a few examples before I run this up. And what we need to do is have carefully designed protocols, carefully designed premises for captive breeding, satisfying all the needs of the animals while they are in captivity. The breeding animals will stay in captivity, but also ensuring that there are suitable habitats available for release, and then having careful and meticulously designed protocols for training the animals before they're released. So training for foraging, training, physical training, they need to be strong and fast. Climbing, digging, jumping, training in how to avoid predators, how to avoid traffic, how to avoid contact with humans, because that is rarely a good thing. Training in how to identify a good habitat for breeding, for example. What visual and auditory and olfactory cues are there that is relevant to this particular species. And also having them reasonably exposed to what they will meet in the wild when it comes to pathogens, parasites, microorganisms, having a good defense, but also sometimes vaccinating them. But not keeping them in a sterile environment, because then they're going to die when they get out there. So it's a trade-off. And of course, having a useful release site that's suitable for the species. Feeding and breeding. If they're group-living animals, release them in a group that's well-composed. Predator control. Using soft release systems where the animals are might be in a bigger enclosure before they're completely released, where they still get a supportive feeding, etc. But then again, we need to know, how do they behave, this species? Will they stay in the release area? If they just immediately leave it, then there isn't much we can do when it comes to supportive feeding, for example. So post-release management is really crucial. We should also remember that these animals that we release may pose a risk to other animals' welfare. If it's reinforcement, it can involve risks to conspecifics, that we actually add to competition for resources, Group dynamics may be disturbed, biosecurity if they bring pathogens. And if we talk about rewilding or translocations, we can also have competition with other species, which needs to be taken into account so that we do not create a new problem instead of the old one. So the take-home messages, finally, is that I would like to stress that if the conditions aren't there, if we do not believe that these animals, however well-bred they are in captivity, are likely to survive in the wild, if we haven't improved the habitats or found a better habitat, there's no reason to just keep adding individuals, because the original problem is still there. We can also discuss how long it's okay to keep parallel populations at zoos and breeding sites from an ethical point of view. And doing all these interventions without proper follow-up, I would argue, is pointless, and that is one of the major problems I see in this area. But it's not easy to follow up. So we need to think about it before we start the programs. So planning, and more planning, A, B, and C. And that's it. Thank you.
Right, I wanted to ask you a question, but you've just answered it in the last slide. But anybody else? Has anybody got a question for Lotta?
I'm completely stunned.
You mentioned something about extinction of animals locally.
Yes.
And not globally. Do you think it's, if it's only a local problem, do you think there's any importance in trying to address it?
I still think there is, because most animals have a niche where they make a difference to other animals as well, to other species. So if we, let's say that we locally make a large predator go extinct, that will influence a lot of other animals, and in the long run may cause a lot of trouble. Also, the fact that we have classified something as a species, it's a gigantic simplification, because even if it's the same species by our definition, we know that there are subspecies with different genetical backgrounds, etc., and we don't know what we lose until it's gone.
Very wise. Thank you for that answer. Professor Van Halsen.
Yeah, I want to make things even more complicated, because the whole idea about, or the definition even, of animal welfare, you can read it there on the panel, is linked to individual animals. Mm-hmm. And I like very much what you've done consistently in your talk, is also talked about the consequences for other animals. Mm-hmm. But I think that's the big problem of animal welfare, of animals in nature, which is that you always have to consider, if you want to save this particular or increase the welfare of this individual, then what the consequences are for the conspecifics and for the community, etc., etc. And that makes it very difficult, because we don't have the instruments. I said that also, that we have not the instruments to compare welfare of animals of different species. So we really have to think about that one.
It is complicated, and it's also so easy to criticize any type of action taken, whereas people who do not act at all usually evade criticism, whereas the consequences of non-action may be even more severe. So, yep, challenging.
Thank you.
One more short question from the video stream audience for Lotta. Are there any legal requirements for getting ethical approval before starting a breeding program?
Depends on what species we're talking about and how, but it's not an ethical approval in the terms of research animals, because these are not research animals, but there are other types of legislation and approvals, but not ethical approvals actually, which to me is very debatable.
Right, anybody else before we close the session? No, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much to the speakers.